Hi, everybody. Hopefully, you all can hear me. Um, I'm streaming on both channels. Again, just because I did promise I was going to follow up that last live stream and explain how the 14th Amendment has made us all slaves. Can y'all post in the comment section to make sure y'all can hear me? Because I just don't want to get into this discussion and then realize later that I have audio problems. So if you can hear me, just post a comment in the section, in the comment section. Um, so I'm not going to read my usual introduction because I am streaming on both channels, but we are going to get into this, and I'm not going to be in here very long, but I just want to give a quick, well, it's not going to be so quick, but um, I just want to give an overview of my argument because y'all know the so-called sovereign citizens have made this argument, but my arguments are a little bit different. I'm not really basing it off of admiralty law or um, this whole straw man corporate uh, argument that they're making. They're saying that I guess I don't need to address what the sovereign citizens are saying because I'm making an original argument. I do understand their argument. Um, Essentially, what they were saying is that the 14th Amendment created, or it made us 14th Amendment citizens as opposed to common law citizens. And it's a legal straw man that when they enforce laws, they're enforcing laws against a fictitious corporate entity in all caps. I'm not even going to address that. So I'm not a part of the so-called sovereign citizen movement. I do understand their argument. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with it. Um, because I don't think that taking away all caps does anything. I'm going by their actual black letter law. The original intent of the 14th Amendment, how it has been construed by the Supreme Court, and the consequences of it. This is judicial activism. It's not the Constitution itself which has created this problem. It is the way the Supreme Court has interpreted. So, um, can y'all let me know if y'all hear me? Because I'm about to get started. Somebody post a comment to let me know you can hear me. All right. So what I'm presenting today are fundamental. These are challenges to fundamental assumptions about American constitutional law. I argue that the very amendments designed to liberate formerly enslaved people actually created a more insidious form of bondage, one that now encompasses every American citizen. So for those who think, again, I have to make these disclaimers because people think I'm playing a race card. No, the 13th and the 14th, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments are called the Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments were supposed to apply to slaves and their descendants, but they have been interpreted to apply to everyone, and it has had perverse consequences, especially the 14th Amendment. Um, so yeah, it wasn't supposed to apply to everybody else. The 14th Amendment wasn't supposed to apply to immigrants and women, and no, it was only supposed to apply to slaves and their descendants. But they have expanded it and then completely turned the Constitution upside down. And this has all been done by the Supreme Court, not by Congress. So let's just give a quick overview of what these amendments are. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime, stating neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The 14th Amendment granted automatic citizenships to all persons born in the United States, declaring all persons born are nationalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state where they reside. I'm going to come back to that because this is compulsory. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. God. So yeah, I don't want to belabor this, but this is a procedural requirement. There's nothing about substantive due process here, nor denied to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment prohibited denying voting rights based on race, stating the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but examine their actual language and subsequent judicial interpretation, and a disturbing pattern emerges. These amendments did not abolish slavery so much as they nationalized it and expanded its reach. What started out as a constitutional solution for Black Americans became a nightmare that now ensnares every American citizen. Um, each amendment contained the seeds of a more sophisticated form of bondage. The 13th Amendment, uh, its exception clause created legal slavery through the criminal justice system. Y'all know there's an exception where it says states can impose involuntary servitude except for punishment of a crime. Well, that's backdoor slavery. Those who are in prison are used not even for state labor, but for private labor. Like they're basically being sold to private corporations. I understand you committed a crime, but why? I mean, I want you to understand that this was a negotiation. They put that language in there on purpose, right? Um, they had to make up for the labor that was being lost with chattel slavery. And so now the prisoners are slaves. They're abject slaves, y'all. I want y'all to know that. I know that they committed crimes, but it should be restorative as opposed to exploitive. They are being exploited. Just because you committed a crime, even if it's murder, does not mean that you should be a slave for a private corporation. The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, let me get to that. The 14th Amendment's mandatory citizenship destroyed the principle of governmental consent. And the 15th Amendment, while appearing to grant political power, actually completed the trap by legitimizing the very system that had enslaved people in the first place. So think about what the 15th Amendment really did. Instead of questioning whether formerly enslaved people should be forced into citizens of states that had brutalized them, it essentially declared you must participate in the system, but now you can vote for your rulers. It reinforced state authority by suggesting that voting rights within the existing structure constituted general political freedom, right? They're going to tell you how you can resist, right? So now you get the right to vote, and now you don't get to, well, it's a distraction that you're going to vote instead of engaging in direct action. Um, by the way, Black men got the right to vote before white women did. So I guess that's something that the feminists do argue. They did take note of that because there is an interplay between racism and sexism, but I'm not going to address that right now. I just want y'all to take note of that. This created the illusion of consent while maintaining actual subjugation. You can vote for which politician will tax you, regulate you, and potentially imprison you, but you cannot vote to opt out of taxation, regulation, or state jurisdiction entirely. You can choose your masters, but you cannot choose to be free of your masters altogether, right? It's supposed to be based on consent, and it's not. To understand how we arrived at this constitutional nightmare, we must examine a crucial debate between the founding fathers, right? So we had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And when I was in law school, the Federalist Society would come and y'all. I guess I could give a quick little story. Maybe it was the first week of law school. They came and they had this book. They were promoting this book by Ann Coulter of high crimes and misdemeanors, and they were talking about Bill Clinton. Back then, I was a big liberal and I didn't like it. Um, I kind of heckled them, and then I made a huge thing, and I just basically said thank you for the free pizza because at those law school meetings you always get free pizza, and it usually be Papa John's. But um, I had a bad impression of the Federalist Society because I don't know. Back then, I was really ignorant. I just thought all conservatives were racist. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what their arguments were. And anyway, so that was my reputation in law school. From the first week, I was the heckler of the Federalist Society. Anyway, I don't know if I needed to share that, but anyway, let's get into it. So the Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, initially opposed creating a Bill of Rights. Their reasoning reveals a prophetic understanding of how constitutional interpretation would eventually enslave us all. The Federalists argued that enumerating specific rights would lead to tyranny. They believed that once you listed certain rights in a constitution, future generations would interpret that document to mean citizens only possess those specifically mentioned rights. In other words, they feared that enumerated rights would become a ceiling rather than a floor, that everything not explicitly protected would be considered fair game for government control. This wasn't paranoid speculation. It was based on their understanding of how legal systems operate under English common law, which formed the foundation of American jurisprudence. People possess inherent natural rights that existed independently of government. These rights did not come from the king or parliament. They preceded government and limited governmental authority. The Federalists understood that the Constitution was not intended to create or grant rights. Instead, it was designed to limit government power by establishing what government could do, with everything else remaining off limits. They feared that by listing specific rights, people would forget this fundamental principle and begin to look to government as the source of their liberties. The Anti-Federalists, however, demanded explicit protections against governmental abuse. The compromise was the Ninth Amendment. Y'all know I'm a big proponent of the Ninth Amendment, so I'm going to be bringing that up a lot. The Ninth Amendment states the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The Ninth Amendment serves as a rule of constitutional construction. It explicitly declares that the Constitution does not create rights. It only enumerates certain rights for emphasis. The people retain all rights that existed under common law and natural law, whether specifically mentioned in the Constitution or not. And this is important when we get into the discussion about abortion and the right to medical assistance in dying, because an adopted decision, the Supreme Court reversed Roe v. Wade based on their interpretation that because abortion is not enumerated in the Constitution, that the people don't have that right. No, it doesn't need to be enumerated in the Constitution. Under the Ninth Amendment, we retain that right because that was a right that was protected under common law. Obviously, there was no abortion. I've already discussed this. The right that was protected was infanticide, that there was a right to privacy. Prosecutors did not prosecute women for engaging in infanticide. If the child died under the age of 1, there would be no prosecution. So anyway, and then the right to medical assistance in dying, the right to die predates government, so the government can't regulate that. And I want y'all to understand this because somebody recently told me that because we have the ability to die, that means we have a right. No, that's not what a right means. Rights don't. The purpose of rights is to limit the government's power, not to give us permission to do anything. So if it's a right, that means that the government can't regulate it. That means that the government cannot enact criminal codes that punish or penalize medical assistance in dying. If it is regulated, that means that it's not a right. That is the purpose of the rights. Rights don't create permission for us. It limits the government's power. The government cannot regulate rights. And this is how the Supreme Court has completely inverted the 14th Amendment, which the 14th Amendment, The 14th Amendment essentially turns rights into privileges granted by the state. Now, let me get through this because I don't have a whole lot of time. Um, Here's what the Federalists' worst nightmare, um, their worst nightmares were materialized. The Supreme Court has strategically moved away from the Ninth Amendment jurisprudence, which would require recognizing that rights exist independent of government. Instead, the court has decided to focus on substantive due process rights under the 14th Amendment. This shift represents a fundamental transformation in American constitutional theory. Under the Ninth Amendment interpretation, your rights exist because you're human. They're natural rights that the government cannot legitimately infringe. Under the 14th Amendment, substantive due process, your rights are civil liberties granted by the state and balanced against state interests. So just to explain the difference, natural rights are absolute. The government cannot violate them regardless of its interests, but civil liberties are privileges that can be restricted whenever the state demonstrates a sufficiently compelling interest. And there's three different layers. There's rational basis, intermediate scrutiny, and then strict scrutiny. But regardless, if it's a natural right, then the state can't have any interest in regulating them. But none of these rights are absolute. There's always loopholes where the government can regulate them because the government's authority exceeds your rights. The Supreme Court's abandonment of natural rights theory means that property rights are no longer natural rights, but instead are granted by the state. Under this framework, the sovereign is the true owner of all property. This is mentioned specifically in the social contract. And I found this out when I sued the city for destroying my tree, that there's actually a lot of case law saying that I don't actually own my property. The state owns my property, and I can only sue. Even if I were to sue a private actor, that's because the state is allowing me to do that. It's not because I have a right based on natural law. So because the state didn't allow me to sue them for destroying my property, I just had to suck it up. I just had to eat those losses, and there was nothing I can do about it. So the court dismissed my case based on sovereign immunity. And then I didn't even sue the state. I sued the damn city, and the city is claiming sovereign immunity. Anyway, this is such a perversion of the Constitution. The state gives individuals a right to exclude others from property, but the state remains the ultimate owner and therefore retains sovereign immunity over that property. This is why the state can exercise eminent domain, force transfers of property from public use. It's why the state can destroy private property and then claim sovereign immunity because, excuse me, y'all. This is why the state can destroy private property and then claim sovereign immunity against lawsuits seeking compensation. Under natural rights theory, this would be impossible because property rights would exist independent of government recognition. Y'all, I told y'all this is the reason why anarchists are against property rights, because I've already explained it, but it basically allows you to exploit that you own capital, and then that gives you a monopoly to exploit the labor of others when it's really the labor that gives value to that property. And so property rights are theft under the anarchist framework. So I told y'all anarchists are technically socialists, but we're anti-statist socialists. So I guess I have come to a more nuanced view because, like I said in that last live stream, because the state exerts so much power over us, I think there should be there should be some social benefits to go along with that power. So if you're going to control every aspect of our life, then there should be some social benefits to go along with it. And if you don't want to provide the social services, then don't try to control us like slaves. There's a point. I'm getting to it, y'all. We're getting to the 14th Amendment right here. The 14th Amendment has become the constitutional basis for virtually all rights claimed, which was never the original intent. This creates a legal framework where citizens must ask the state's permission to exercise rights that should exist independent of government recognition. When someone sues the state for violating their rights, they must identify a specific liberty or property interest that has been denied under the 14th Amendment. But here's the trap. The state can then claim sovereign immunity against the lawsuit itself, which precludes discovery and any meaningful challenge. Citizens are forced to sue state actors under 42 U.S.C. 1983 in their individual or official capacity, but these actors are still protected with qualified immunity, a doctrine created entirely by the Supreme Court that exists nowhere in the Constitution. Qualified immunity protects government officials from lawsuits unless they violated clearly established rights. And by clearly established rights, what they mean are rights that have been granted by the state. So if the state has not recognized the right, then it doesn't exist, which is a complete perversion of the Ninth Amendment, creating a legal standard that's nearly impossible to meet. This framework reveals the truth about governmental system. The states have more power than the people themselves. The state is our master, not our servant. The people are not sovereign. The state is sovereign over its people. The state operates as a corporate entity that serves as an end unto itself. It doesn't serve the common good. It serves its own interests against the interests of the people. The state maintains power through manufactured consent. People vote against their rational self-interest because the state has become a nebulous, all-powerful entity that cannot be challenged. The state has become God. Just as the medieval sovereign couldn't be challenged because they were believed to be acting on behalf of God, the modern state claims absolute authority that cannot be challenged. This is exactly what the founding fathers were trying to escape when they fought against the British Crown. The original purpose of the Constitution was not to create rights, but to limit government power. Instead, it's being interpreted as a document that creates rights, the exact opposite of its intended function. This inversion has made the state the source of all authority rather than a limited entity restrained by pre-existing rights. Now let's get to the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment declares all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. So I want y'all to let that sink in. You're citizens not just of the United States, but also of the state where you reside. So this is mandatory language. We are citizens. We don't get to choose to be citizens. This represents a fundamental violation of the principle of consent, which basically undermines the legitimacy of government, that you don't get to opt in. I mean, I think the language should have been that states can't deny you citizen. Remember, the 14th Amendment was really supposed to apply to descendants of slaves because slaves were not citizens. So the language should have been that states may not deprive or deny former slaves citizenship based on color, but it's making it mandatory. And the way it's being interpreted, it applies to everybody. So everybody who is born is a citizen, which, to borrow from the language of the so-called sovereign citizens, that makes you a subject. And the sovereign citizens will argue that a subject is a slave. Now, I can get into what the social contract says about that, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau claims that you're both the subject and the sovereign. The people are sovereign. I actually tend to disagree with Rousseau on this specific point. Now let's keep going. Think about the historical absurdity. We forced the descendants of enslaved people to become citizens of the very states that held them in bondage. These state governments had spent generations treating people as property, and our constitutional solution was to declare them permanent subjects of those same governmental entities. Abraham Lincoln did not support this. Abraham Lincoln actually did not want to integrate the former slaves. He wanted them to have sovereign land. And what happened to Abraham Lincoln? Yeah, his plan a better plan than what the Jim Crow and the aftermath of slavery was a complete nightmare. But yeah, Abraham Lincoln had the right idea. Under a Republican form of government, the people are sovereign. The state exists only to act on behalf of its citizens, but mandatory citizenship inverts this relationship, making the state the master and citizens the subjects. The very constitutional framework meant to protect freed slaves has become the mechanism through which the state claims ownership over all Americans. This raises a profound ethical question that most Americans refuse to confront. By procreating under this system, we are enslaving children to the state. Every child born in America is automatically conscripted into citizenship without their consent. Parents become agents of state enslavement, delivering new subjects to a system that will claim ultimate and absolute authority over their children's lives, labor, and property. So consider the moral implications. You cannot give informed consent on behalf of another person to a relationship of permanent subjugation. Um, yeah, and what is his name? I think his name is Thoreau. He talks about how the Constitution is completely illegitimate, which I'm going to come back to that on my anarchist channel. I'm not. This doesn't really relate to anti-natalism, but there's an argument that the Constitution itself is illegitimate because it only applies to the generations that the current generation at the time that agreed to it. Um, it's a complicated argument, but I'm going to come back to that. I think his name is Thoreau. It's a French name. Anyway, yeah, this is exactly what happens when children are born into mandatory citizenship. The state immediately claims ownership over that child through citizenship laws, educational requirements, taxation, obligations, and criminal jurisdiction. Right. So every time you get pulled over by a pirate, I mean a road pirate, did you consent to that? No. You didn't consent to any of this bullshit. How is it legitimate? Your parents imposed life on you, and now you're subject to all these laws. The government has absolute authority over you. Again, I'm not talking about the federal government. I'm talking about the state. The state is the oppressor, not the federal government. The child will grow up never knowing they had any choice in this arrangement. They will be conditioned to believe this enslavement is freedom, right? Could you believe that citizenship is freedom? Nobody wants to be a damn citizen. Now, prior to a citizen, I would rather be a citizen. That's the state. To government, any or subjects of a foreign state. Um, Let me just explain what that means. What the 11th Amendment essentially says is states have sovereign immunity by citizens of foreign states. So if you live to the state of Texas, that's what the original intent was. It was only immunity against foreign citizens. But now the Supreme Court has completely turned this around. Um, In 1890, Hans versus Louisiana, the Supreme Court fabricated a doctrine of absolute state sovereign immunity. Justice Bradley's majority opinion essentially rewrote the Constitution, extending immunity far beyond the amendment's text to protect states from accountability to their own citizens. So now, even if you are a citizen, you can't sue your own state, which really belies Rousseau's argument that the people are sovereign. The people are not sovereign. You're the subject, but you don't have a dual role of being a so-called sovereign citizen. I think that's paradoxical. You can't be a citizen and sovereign, especially when only the state itself has sovereign immunity. So if I'm sovereign, then I should have sovereign immunity. When you try to prosecute me for going over the speed limit, then I should be the one claiming sovereign immunity, not the state. All right, so here's the constitutional argument. The 13th Amendment prohibition of slavery should have automatically notified the Supreme Court's interpretation of the 11th Amendment. You cannot simultaneously prohibit slavery while granting states sovereign immunity over their citizens. These concepts are fundamentally incompatible. When a government enjoys sovereign immunity, it can harm its citizens with impunity. It can destroy property without compensation, deprive liberty without due process, and face no legal consequences. So if you can't sue the state, then you have no legal recourse, right? So if the state has immunity, then that means you don't have any fucking rights. You can have rights, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just this is this rhetoric that you have rights, but you can't actually sue the state. So what's the point? And I told y'all that you can sue the state actors under 42 USC 1983, but the way they have interpreted that, the Supreme, it's the courts that have done this. They have interpreted to where you can't sue them unless there's clearly, the state has violated clearly established law. What was the other requirement? There's two prongs to that. Under color of law. Anyway, I can talk about 42 USC 1983, but I guess I need to get through this. So I think that the 13th Amendment should have nullified sovereign immunity, because sovereign immunity means that you're a slave. What did I tell y'all? Duties without rights make slavery. Rights without duties make anarchy. This is how I became an anarchist. When you sue the state, you have no legal recourse. They're going to dismiss it. So I realized that I don't have any fucking rights. I mean, I read the Constitution. I took it very seriously, but in practice, it doesn't mean shit. It's just, I don't even understand the purpose of having a Constitution if you can't enforce it. You can say that you have these rights, but when you sue the state or a state actor, it's going to be dismissed, even if they do violate clearly established law. Oh, the other prong is that they acted in good faith. So you have to show that they violate clearly established law and that the state actor didn't act in good faith. So that's really subjective. You can't show somebody's intent. So even if you killed somebody, if a police officer literally murdered somebody on camera, they didn't violate clearly established law because whatever, they're going to find some justification, and they acted in good faith because they believe you had a gun. So they're going to get off. So you basically have no damn rights. You're essentially a slave. So under English common law, which formed the foundation of our legal system, the king was sovereign. The king derived his authority from God. That's the divine right of kings. Subjects of the king had no rights against the king because the king was God's representative on earth. When Hans versus Louisiana granted states sovereign immunity against their own citizens, the Supreme Court essentially made states into kings. If a state has sovereign immunity, it means the state is above the law when dealing with its own citizens. The state can harm you, violate your rights, take your property, and you have no legal recourse. But here's the key insight. Under the traditional understanding of sovereignty, the state is sovereign over you, then you are not free. You are a subject. And in the context of American history, what we call people who are forced to work for the benefit of another without compensation and without the ability to leave, we call them slaves. So when I talk about slavery, I'm not just talking about blacks, because I know people are going to make that assumption. I'm saying that all of us are slaves under this modern framework, that you don't have any rights, and you have to work and pay the government taxes, but they have no duty to you. This is bullshit. So this connects to the social contract theory, which heavily influenced American constitutional thought. Under certain interpretations of social contract theory, when you become a citizen, you surrender your natural rights to the sovereign in exchange for protection. Benjamin Franklin actually said, he said, those who would give up their liberty for freedom deserve neither. And that's what everyone does. Y'all can talk about the COVID debacle. People were so willing to concede all this authority to the state because they wanted protection. The sovereign then grants you certain privileges and rights. Complete inversion of the Ninth Amendment. So if your rights come from the state rather than from natural law, then the state owns you. Your property, your labor, your very existence becomes subject to the will of the sovereign state. This is why I argue we don't actually have rights in America. We have privileges granted by the state, and the state can revoke those privileges whenever it chooses. So let's get back to the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment declares all persons born or nationalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the states and the states wherein they reside. Notice the mandatory language. We are citizens, not that we may choose to become citizens. This represents a fundamental violation of the principle of consent that supposedly underlies legitimate government. Think about the absurdity. Remember, the 14th Amendment was only supposed to apply to slaves and their descendants. We forced the descendants of enslaved people to become citizens of the very states that held them in bondage. These state governments have spent generations treating people as property, and and then you make them permanent subjects to those same governmental entities. Under a Republican form of government, the people are sovereign. The state exists only to act on behalf of its citizens, but mandatory citizenship inverts this relationship, making the state the master and citizens the subject. The very constitutional framework meant to protect free people or freed slaves has become the mechanism through which the state claims ownership over all Americans. All right, so let's get into Plessy versus Ferguson because I've mentioned this before, and this is the crux of my upcoming book. Um, why I say that we're slaves if we don't have the right to medical assistance and dying. So the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson defined slavery as the deprivation of the right to the disposal of one's person, property, and services. By this standard, established by the Supreme Court itself, American states have enslaved their entire populations. First, we don't have the right to the disposal of our person. States, every state in the United States, because they always talk about laboratories of democracy. If you don't like it, you can just go to another state. No, every state in America has criminalized suicide and assisted suicide, institutionalized those who express suicidal ideation, and maintain comprehensive health and safety codes that control bodily autonomy. The state claims absolute authority over your physical existence. We don't have the right to the disposal of property. Through sovereign immunity, states can destroy private property without compensation. Civil asset forfeiture allows seizure of property without criminal conviction. Eminent domain permits forced transfer for public use, a term so broadly interpreted as to be meaningless. I told y'all how they destroyed my property. They didn't even claim eminent domain because it wasn't taken for public use. They just claimed sovereign immunity, a blanket sovereign immunity. And I just got stuck to eat the cost. It was a complete waste of time. And I'm actually pretty much done with the courts because I don't trust the courts. You can use the legal system to enforce your rights against other citizens, but to sue the state is a complete waste of time. Even the most skilled attorney, they're very limited circumstances in which you can win against the state. And the last one, disposal of services. Occupational license requirements create state-controlled barriers to entry. Professional licensing boards, typically dominated by existing practitioners, limit competition and deny citizens the fundamental right to earn a livelihood through honest labor. These aren't isolated governmental overreaches. They are systematic control over every aspect of human life. State imposes taxation without meaningful consent. You cannot opt out of citizenship to avoid these obligations. This is the reason why the right to die is so critical. You can't opt out. You can't just move to another state. So you need to have the right to medical assistance and dying to get out of this entire oppressive system. You did not consent to be here in the first place. So why is the state, well, we know why, but the state should not have the authority to compel you to remain in perpetual slavery against your will. And I'm using the word slavery. We are fucking slaves. If you don't have a right to die, you don't own your fucking life. Um, so the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery; it nationalized it. Immediately after ratification, Southern states enacted black codes and later Jim Crow laws that specifically were designed to criminalize normal behavior by formerly enslaved people. Uh, Basically, the vagrancy laws, um, employment contract requirements, loitering, and then now we have the backdoor slavery due prison, the prison industrial complex. So let's get into the illegitimacy of the social contract. Our relationship with the state lacks fundamental legitimacy that comes from consent. We never agreed to be citizens. We were made citizens at birth. We cannot withdraw from this relationship even if we recognize its oppressive nature. This violates every principle of legitimate government authority. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed. But how can we consent to being meaningful? How can consent be meaningful if we can neither be it can never, excuse me, how can consent be meaningful if consent cannot be given, right? Because we didn't choose to be born, and it cannot be withdrawn. So it can't be withdrawn because you don't have the right to die. So it was illegitimate from the outset. They imposed life on you, and now you're trapped in a system that you don't even agree with. How are you supposed to opt out? Somebody said you can move to another country if you have the financial resources to do that, but that's not an entitlement. You don't have necessarily have a right to move to another country. The country may allow you to move there. Um, Good luck trying to find a means of earning a livelihood, right? How are you just going to pick and go to another country with no money, no job, and just cross your fingers and hope that everything works out? That's going to require some level of wealth to be able to do that. Um, it's not so easy. Let's just pick up and just go to Canada or no, no. People come to the from the third world to the United States specifically because it's going to improve their quality of life. Um, I don't know. I mean, I guess if you could live in a state of nature, maybe that would be fine. But it's not like you're necessarily going to be free. You're not going to be liberated by picking up and going to another country. That other country also has um, state tyranny, and so you're just going to be subject to another form of government. It I mean, no, there's no way around it. The only solution is to legalize medical assistance in dying. It's not moving to and going to another state. It's not going to another country. You need the right to actually die to get out of this entire globalist system. So I think that citizenship should be voluntary. It should be a voluntary association, not a compulsory assignment. When states, um, while states should not have the authority to deny citizenship based on race, um, they also should be permitted to impose citizenship on unwilling populations. This principle aligns with Abraham Lincoln's vision of post-emancipation America, which I've already described, so I'm not going to go over that again. Um, I mean, I guess to wrap this all up, the 14th Amendment is, is basically a scam because it doesn't even do what it was originally intended to do. It was supposed to provide equal protection for slaves and their descendants. It does the complete opposite. Now everyone is a citizen of the state. Um, because okay, so for example, if I file a lawsuit, I could argue that I'm not a citizen of the state, and therefore the state. Well, actually, I couldn't argue that because that was the original intent of the 11th Amendment. The 11th Amendment was supposed to be um, sovereign immunity against foreign citizens, but now they're saying that it's immunity against citizens of your own state. So really, you can't claim immunity either way. I was going to say that I could claim immunity by saying that I'm not a citizen, but no. See, when I was talking about how we're slaves, and when you go into court, they're saying who is your master. What they're saying is who is your state. If your state did not give you the permission to come here and sue them in federal court, then you have no business being here. Who is your master? Your master is the state. So the attorney general has standing to sue on behalf of its citizens, right? Ken Paxton does it all the time. Greg Abbott did it all the time, right? He just sat in his office filing lawsuits against the Obama administration. This is what they do. This is what they get paid tens of thousands of dollars to do, just to sit on their asses and file lawsuits, which are frivolous, by the way. If a private citizen were to do that, they would be called a vexatious litigant. But they get paid to file these frivolous lawsuits on behalf of the citizens. But you cannot file a lawsuit on your own behalf because you're not sovereign. That's what I'm trying to tell you. This is the reason why sovereignty is so important. Sovereignty is more important than anything else. I've talked to y'all about this. This is the reason why I don't support cash reparations. Now, when y'all hear me talk about cash reparations, I may mention that in passing only because I'm trying to latch on to what I want, which is sovereignty. If I so people are very shallow and materialistic, they want some damn money. So even though I don't necessarily support cash reparations, I'm going to use that as a carrot on a stick so that I can say, okay, you want your damn cash reparations? Okay, I want sovereignty. So I'll support your fucking cash reparations if you can help me to get some damn sovereignty. It's not because I actually give a shit about some damn cash reparations. No, I don't support that shit because if you're still under their system, then that money goes to the damn state anyway. So I don't support cash reparations. But rhetorically, I'm going to say that because I'm trying to get people to support sovereignty. But those of you think I'm playing a race card, no, it's strategic. I know what the hell I'm doing. I'm doing that shit on purpose, right? People don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear these complicated legal arguments about how sovereignty is more important than cash rep. No, so I'm going to say that because I want them to support sovereignty. It's not because I actually support cash reparations. Okay, y'all. Let me see if I have any comments. I do have comments. Okay. Let me see if I can pull these comments up. Help provide the language of your ancestral truth. Teach your children to do the same. Speak truth always. Facts. Right. And America was built on slavery. I guess the okie doke is that we think that slavery only applies to blacks. And what the reason why I was saying that whites need to know that they are oppressed too, because they need to understand that this doesn't just apply to us. It applies to them too. It applies to all of us. This entire system has enslaved us all. And I think it's important, I guess, because most black people already accept that they are, oppressed or whatever. But I think white people need to understand that too. You are oppressed too. So you do this whole black white thing, and then you think, okay, well, I'm not oppressed, so this has nothing to do with me. It does. It's all of us. This entire system is oppressive as fuck. And you should not be having children. You should not procreate and put children into this oppressive ass system. We can talk about capitalism, but statism is far worse. Capitalism is just an offshoot of statism. Capitalism only exists because the state gives recognition to private property. So you cannot just skip and jump straight to capitalism without addressing statism. All right. Yeah, they always say that if you don't like America, you can just leave. It's a non sequitur. All right, y'all. So I guess I did get through that. I mean, I was hoping there'd be some kind of pushback because this is a novel argument. This is not the argument that sovereign citizens are making. I'm really relying on an argument that was framed by Plessy versus Ferguson. that slavery is the deprivation of the disposal of one's person, property, and services. So by that definition, we are all slaves. And I just explained to y'all why. We don't have the right to dispose of our person, our property, or our services. So manifestly, that makes us all slaves. Now, if I were to argue this in court, they would try to find some loophole. They would find some kind of minutia to try to get around it. That's what I'm saying. The Constitution is not even worth the paper it was written on. It's garbage. It's trash. I don't. It's almost like I don't understand what it does. It gives the appearance of legitimacy to say that we're a democracy, we're a free society, we have these constitutional rights. We don't. If you can't actually enforce them in court, if they're going to disclaim immunity, then you don't have any damn rights. You literally don't have any rights. At least not any rights that can be enforced against the state. And the most fundamental right is the principle of self-ownership. So if you don't even have the right to die, then you don't own yourself, which makes you a fucking slave. I think I am done. I'm going to go ahead and get off here. Like I said, I'm streaming on both channels, so I'm not going to use my usual ending. So with that, thank y'all for being here. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe.